Chicago, winter of 1992. The city hummed with the low, distant rhythm of traffic, sirens, and hurried footsteps. A place where people kept their eyes forward and their thoughts guarded, rushing past one another with the practiced indifference of those long used to the cold. Snow lined the sidewalks like a faded memory, and the buildings, stained with decades of smoke and wind, towered in silence over a world too busy to look back. At the intersection of State Street and Van Buren, where the stoplights seemed to blink slower in the morning frost, an elderly man stood alone. His coat was torn at the cuffs, his beard unkempt, and his eyes fixed not on the passing cars, but on something deeper, somewhere else. In his hand, he held a small tin cup. On his head, slightly askew, was a faded army cap, and pinned to it, dulled by time but unmistakable, a silver star medal. Most people didn't see it, or rather they refused to. To them, he was just another homeless man, one of the many shadows on their morning commute, someone to be avoided, ignored, forgotten. But then, on a morning colder than most, something changed. A family car, a beat-up Buick Skylark, pulled up at the red light. Inside, a young boy in the back seat leaned toward the window, his breath fogging the glass. He squinted, pointed, and said with the kind of clarity only children possess, "Dad, look, he's a soldier, he's got a medal." The words hung in the air, cutting through the static of the radio and the silent tension of the windshield. The father turned, glanced at the man, then back at his son, and something in him shifted. He put the car in park, opened the door, and walked toward the old man. He didn't offer money. He didn't ask if he needed food. Instead, standing there on the icy sidewalk, he asked quietly, "Sir, where did you serve?" The veteran looked up, surprised, not by the question, but by the fact that someone had finally asked it. His lips parted slightly, as if he hadn't spoken in weeks. And in that moment, in the middle of a city that had forgotten so much, a door quietly opened. Not a physical one, but the kind that only opens with memory, regret, and the faint hope that someone might still care. That man's name was Walter, and what he carried inside him was not just a medal, but a story. If this story touches you the way it touched me writing it, give it a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep sharing true stories that inspire, move, and surprise. And now, get ready, because what comes next changes everything. His name was Walter, though most people never knew it. On the streets of downtown Chicago, he was just another figure on the corner, hunched beneath the layers of a worn coat and the chill of a city that had long stopped asking names. He stood by that same traffic light every morning, not for charity, not out of desperation, but because something in him refused to vanish entirely, something too stubborn to surrender to the quiet death of anonymity. Walter was 78 years old, though time had done more to him than numbers ever could. The years showed in his hands, cracked and trembling, in the stoop of his shoulders, and in the way his eyes seemed to look not at what was before him, but through it, as if scanning some distant battlefield no one else could see. He had once been someone, a soldier, a father, a husband. But now, standing at the intersection of State and Van Buren, with a battered tin cup and a wool cap pinned with a silver star, he was invisible, not because people didn't see him, but because they had chosen not to. He came there every morning from the edge of the South Side, where he slept in a makeshift shelter beneath a defunct railway bridge. In his coat pocket, wrapped in a plastic sandwich bag, were the only things he still called his own: a faded photograph of a woman holding a baby, an army-issued dog tag etched with a serial number and his blood type, and a crumpled envelope with an address in Bismarck, North Dakota, long scratched out. The medal on his cap was real, earned, not given. He'd received it in Vietnam after pulling 2 fellow soldiers from a burning vehicle under enemy fire. They gave him a silver star. But when he came home, there were no parades, no applause, only silence. Only the look in his wife's eyes when he woke up screaming, and the door that eventually closed behind her when she left. Only the job offers that never came, and the memories that never left. So he stood at the corner. Most days, no one stopped. Some glanced. Some dropped a coin or two without breaking stride. Others crossed the street, as if his presence might infect them with guilt. He didn't blame them. They were busy. They had lives. He had stopped expecting anything years ago. And then came that moment, brief, quiet, but irreversible. The child's voice had startled him, not because it was loud, but because it had recognized something. "He's got a medal!" 4 words, spoken with awe, not pity. It was the first time in years someone had looked past the dirt, the smell, the shaking hands, and seen what remained pinned to his soul. When the man, Tom, stepped out of the car and approached, Walter braced himself for either a reprimand or a handout. But instead, Tom asked him where he had served. The question hit Walter like a gust of warm wind through a long, frozen window. He opened his mouth but said nothing at first. Then quietly, he murmured, "Nam, 68, Da Nang." Tom nodded respectfully, then pointed to the cafe across the street. "Mind if I buy you a coffee?" Walter hesitated, not because he didn't want it, but because trust was a currency he rarely traded. But something in the man's eyes, in the way he hadn't looked away, felt different. He nodded. They crossed the street together, 2 silhouettes moving slowly beneath the cold sun, unnoticed by most. Inside the cafe, the heat embraced him like an old friend. The waitress didn't flinch when Tom ordered 2 coffees and slid one over to Walter. He wrapped his hands around the cup, letting the warmth seep into his bones before he took a sip. For a long time, they said nothing, just sat. Tom didn't press. He asked small things, what kind of coffee Walter liked, whether he always came to that corner. Walter answered in fragments. He hadn't talked like this in years. Most of his stories lived inside his head, tangled with things he didn't want to remember. But Tom listened, truly listened, and that, more than anything, made the words begin to come. He talked about the chopper that went down in the jungle, about carrying a wounded friend 3 miles through enemy territory, about the night he held a dying 19-year-old and whispered a lie, "You're gonna be okay," because it was all he had left to give. He didn't cry. He never did. But when he spoke, the pain bled into the spaces between his words. When the coffee was finished, Tom asked if he could see him again. Walter shrugged. "Sure," he said, as if it didn't matter, though something in his voice said it did. As they walked back to the intersection, the boy was still waiting in the car. He smiled and waved. Walter raised his hand in return, a salute, just barely. And for the first time in a very long time, someone waved back. Walter never spoke of the war unless someone truly wanted to hear, not out of shame, and not because the memories were gone, but because most people asked out of curiosity, not care. They wanted the movie version, the fire, the heroism, the one-liners. But war, the kind Walter knew, was quieter, dirtier, slower. It crept into your bones and stayed there long after the shooting stopped. He had been drafted at 19, fresh out of a vocational school where he'd learned welding. He'd planned to work at a shipyard, maybe save up for a used pickup and a 1-bedroom place. Instead, he ended up halfway around the world in a jungle that smelled of rot and rain, where everything was green but nothing felt alive. He was deployed to Vietnam in late 1967, assigned to the 1st Marine Division. The base at Da Nang was their starting point, but the war didn't stay in one place. It moved, slithered, ambushed. Walter learned quickly that survival depended not on rank or strength, but on instincts, on knowing when to run, when to shut up, when to trust your gut. He remembered his first firefight like a wound, not because of the bullets, but because of the silence afterward. It had been a routine patrol. Then came the sudden crack of gunfire, the chaos of voices shouting commands, the scream of a comrade hit in the leg. Walter had returned fire, crawled through the mud, dragged the wounded man to cover. Later, the officer told him he'd shown unusual bravery under fire. That's when they gave him the Silver Star. But Walter never thought of it as bravery. He thought of it as reflex. More battles followed. The Tet offensive turned every corner into a death trap. He saw villages burn. He carried bodies in the rain. He watched a child die with a look in her eyes that he could never forget. He learned to sleep with his boots on and his rifle within reach. He stopped writing home because he didn't know what to say anymore. How do you tell someone you still dream in gunfire? When the war ended, or at least when his part in it did, Walter returned to Chicago, but the world he came back to wasn't the one he left. Protesters spit near his uniform. A hiring manager told him, "We don't want troublemakers." He tried to go to the VA, but the line was long and the answers short. His wife, sweet, patient Marlene, held him for hours when the nightmares came, but over the years, even she began to break under the weight of what she couldn't see. Their marriage lasted until 1983, when she left with their daughter, saying she needed to breathe again. Walter didn't blame her. How do you live with someone who wakes up swinging, who won't talk about what's wrong, who smiles less and less with each passing year? After that, it all unraveled slowly. The job he found as a janitor dried up when the building closed. His savings vanished. He sold what little he had to pay for a week's motel, then another. Then came the streets. Still, he kept the medal. Not because it meant he was a hero, he never believed that, but because it reminded him that once, in a place that made no sense, he had done something that mattered. He had saved 2 lives. He had come back when others didn't. And that had to count for something, didn't it? That's what he asked Tom one cold morning, as they sat in the same booth at the cafe, sipping burnt coffee and watching the world pass by. "Does it count?" Walter asked. "If no one remembers?" Tom, who had grown up after Vietnam, who had never served, didn't pretend to understand fully, but he said something simple and honest. "I remember now." And somehow, that was enough to keep Walter talking. Over the following weeks, he shared more, not always in order, not always with detail, but with the raw honesty of someone who'd held it in too long. He spoke of a medic named Ray who sang Motown tunes while tending wounds, of a friend who'd been shot saving a Vietnamese child, of the weight of a body over your shoulder, heavier than fear. He spoke of guilt, not just survivor's guilt, but the kind that came from wondering if he'd become too used to death, the kind that kept him from calling his daughter, the kind that made silence feel like the only language left. Tom began taking notes, not for an article, not yet, but because he sensed that this story, once lost, would never be recovered again. It was a map of pain and purpose. And in it, he saw a truth bigger than one man, a nation that had asked for everything and then forgotten to say thank you. The third time they met at the cafe, Walter came in with something tucked inside his coat, not just for warmth, but held close to his chest, like it had weight beyond its size. Tom noticed it when Walter sat down. He didn't say anything at first, he never did. Their conversations moved at Walter's pace, not rushed, never forced. Silence, with him, was never empty. It was part of the language. They ordered coffee as usual, and Tom unwrapped a muffin, splitting it in half, sliding a piece across the table like a quiet offering. Walter took it, nodded. For a few minutes, they watched people outside the window, bundled in coats, moving fast and forgetting slower. Then Walter reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small, weathered envelope. Yellowed, creased at the corners, sealed, but soft from time. He placed it gently on the table, between the coffee cups, and let his fingers rest on top of it, as if deciding whether or not to let it go. "I've carried this for over 40 years, he said quietly. "Never opened it, never mailed it, just kept it. For what, I don't know." Tom didn't reach for it. He just waited, sensing the room shift slightly, the kind of hush that falls when something sacred is laid bare. "Her name was Anna," Walter continued. "She was a nurse, not one of ours. She was Vietnamese. I met her in a makeshift clinic outside Hue. It was 1969. I'd been wounded, shrapnel in the side, nothing fatal, but enough to stop me for a few weeks." He looked past Tom, as if the cafe wall had become a screen playing back scenes long buried. They didn't have real supplies, just torn bedsheets and boiled water. She worked non-stop, no mask, no gloves, just her hands and her voice. She had this way of talking to the wounded, not loudly, not cheerfully, just steady, like her voice could hold you together until the bleeding stopped. That they had spoken little. Language was a barrier, but not an end. In the quiet, they had shared food, exchanged photos, smiled over things they couldn't explain. He remembered how she sat beside him at night, humming something he couldn't name. The only time they touched was when she cleaned his wound, but in that touch, he felt more safety than he had since arriving in country. "I left with a promise," he said. "Told her I'd come back after the war. Told her I'd find her. I meant it. God help me, I meant it. But wars don't end when soldiers leave. They only shift." The mission was extended. His unit redeployed. When he finally came home, the chaos of readjustment swallowed him. He searched for her name, wrote the letter, never sent it. I didn't know where to send it. I didn't even know if she'd made it. And if she had, would she want to hear from me, from a soldier in the same uniform that destroyed her country? The letter sat in his pocket through job interviews, cold nights, hospital waiting rooms. It traveled with him through motels and shelters and eventually to that traffic light on State Street. "I guess I thought if someone ever cared enough to ask, I'd show it to them." Tom, still silent, finally spoke. "Can I read it?" Walter nodded. "Not today, maybe later. I just wanted someone to know it existed." For the next hour, they didn't say much. They watched the street. They drank coffee, but something between them had changed. Not in words, but in gravity, as if a door had opened and the wind had shifted. That night, Tom stayed up writing. Not his usual articles, not sound bites or angles, just notes, sentences, pieces of Walter's story scribbled into a notebook, his memory now on paper before it could disappear again. A few days later, he reached out to his editor, not with a pitch, but with a plea. "There's a man I think we need to write about. Not because he's famous, but because we owe him a voice." He didn't mention the letter. Not yet. Tom returned to the cafe, not as a journalist chasing a story, but as someone entrusted with one. He brought copies of records he'd found, old maps of Vietnam, redacted reports, articles about refugee hospitals from the war. Walter looked through them slowly, his fingers lingering on the names, the places, as if trying to stitch together a timeline his memory had unraveled. When Tom asked if he'd be willing to share the letter, to let it be part of something public, something lasting, Walter didn't answer right away. He held the envelope in his hands for a long time. "I'm not looking for closure," he said. "I just want someone to know she was real." Tom placed his hand on the table, palm up, no pressure, just a presence. Walter slid the envelope over. When Tom's article was published, it didn't explode. It didn't trend. It didn't break the internet. It moved slowly, steadily, like the tide creeping back in, reclaiming a shoreline that had been abandoned. Readers passed it quietly to one another, folded it into emails, printed it out and taped it to community boards and the backs of break-room doors. A veteran at the traffic light, the man with the silver star. There was a photo, Walter, standing on State Street in the pale winter sun, the medal on his cap glinting faintly, his face turned slightly away from the lens. Not because he was ashamed, because he wasn't used to being seen. The story struck a chord. Letters came, emails, messages from veterans, from social workers, from teachers, from people who said they'd passed him on the street and never looked twice. And now they couldn't forget his face. A group of high school students in Evanston wrote an open letter, thanking him for his service and asking if they could visit. A church downtown offered him a permanent room, and a local VA administrator, embarrassed by the years of oversight, reached out to schedule an evaluation, benefits, late apologies. But the most unexpected response came from a woman in California. Her name was Lena, and she wrote not to the paper but directly to Tom, a letter handwritten in blue ink with a return address in Sacramento and a photograph folded inside. The photo was black and white, slightly grainy. It showed a young Vietnamese woman in a nurse's uniform standing outside a makeshift clinic with sunlight slicing across her face. On the back, in faded pencil, Anna, who, 1969. The letter explained that Lena was Anna's niece. Her aunt had passed away in 1987 after a quiet life in San Jose, where she worked as a nurse in a community clinic. She never married, but she had kept a journal. In one of the final entries, there was a single name underlined: Walter. She never said what happened between them. But Lena had always known it meant something unfinished. "I believe she never stopped wondering if you made it out," the letter read. "And now, after all these years, I think she'd want you to know. She remembered you too." Tom brought the letter to Walter the next day. They sat outside the cafe, the wind soft but sharp, brushing past the collar of Walter's coat. He read the letter slowly, then again, then unfolded the photo and looked at it for a long time. "That's her," he said, his voice thick but clear. "That's her." He didn't cry. He just held the photo with both hands, like something fragile and holy. After that day, things shifted. Tom wrote a follow-up piece, not a profile this time, but a reflection. On memory, on the stories we bury with the people we forget, on the power of one child's voice to reopen a life. He titled it, "The Letter That Found Its Way." Soon after, a small ceremony was held at the cafe, impromptu, informal. Veterans came. Strangers came. The boy from the car came too, wearing a tiny American flag pin and holding a drawing he made of Walter and his medal. Walter sat quietly through it all, shaking hands, nodding thanks. When asked to speak, he simply said, "I was there. That's all." Eventually, Walter accepted a room offered by the church, not because he needed shelter, but because, as he put it, "It's time I stopped sleeping where nobody knows my name." Boo. The room was small, but it had a window that faced the street, and every morning he sat by it, watching the city pass, just as he always had. Only now, he was part of it. He kept the letter from Lena in a frame on his nightstand, beside Anna's photo and his silver star, which he no longer wore on his cap, but placed gently on a shelf above his bed. It no longer needed to be seen by the world. It had already spoken. Tom and his son visited often. The boy, now old enough to understand more than just uniforms and medals, asked real questions. And Walter answered, not with stories of blood and gunfire, but with the kind of wisdom that only comes from pain survived. About silence, about promises, about the courage it takes to stay alive when part of you doesn't want to. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't, but every visit ended the same way, with the boy saying, "See you soon, Mr. Walter." And Walter, smiling faintly, replying, "I'll be here." Walter spent his final years in quiet dignity, not with fanfare, not with fame, but with a sense of stillness that came only after a lifetime of noise. He lived simply, in that modest room overlooking a corner of the city he had once watched from the sidewalk. Now he sat by the window from the other side of the glass, a warm blanket across his knees, the soft hum of traffic below, and a coffee cup in hand that was always full, never shaken by cold. He didn't attend public events. He never spoke on television. When people asked him for interviews, he politely declined. "Let the story speak," he'd say. "I already did." But the visits with Tom and the boy, whose name was Michael, became his lifeline. They'd come every Sunday, sometimes bringing books, sometimes just silence. Walter told him stories not about battles, but about survival, about what it meant to lose things and live on anyway, about the difference between being alive and being remembered. Michael began writing the stories down, just like his father. At school, he gave a report titled "The Hero at the Crosswalk," and his teacher cried in the back of the room. Walter didn't know that, but he would have smiled if he did. He began to slow in the fall of '96. The cold came earlier that year, and his body, though tougher than most, started to retreat inward. He didn't complain. He simply sat longer by the window, as if memorizing the way the light touched the bricks across the street. One afternoon, Tom found him resting in his chair, the blanket over his legs, a photo of Anna in one hand, and Michael's latest drawing in the other. He was still breathing, but slower. That evening they sat together, the three of them, and spoke very little. Tom asked gently, "Is there anything you want to say?" Walter looked at Michael, then out the window. His voice was weak but certain, his eyes still sharp. "The war took almost everything from me," he said, pausing. "But that boy gave me my name back." They were the last words he ever spoke. Walter passed quietly that night. At his service, attended by friends, strangers, and a full color guard from the local VA, Michael read those words aloud. They were engraved on Walter's headstone, just beneath his name and the years he lived. "The war took almost everything from me, but that boy gave me my name back." He was buried with his silver star and the letter from Lena, folded but never sealed, in his breast pocket. Anna's photo lay atop his heart. Walter's story is not unique in numbers. There are many like him, but stories like his often go untold, unnoticed, unremembered, until someone stops, until a child points and asks a question, and in doing so, reclaims a name the world forgot. We share new stories every day, real voices that move and inspire. If this story touched you like it touched us, leave a like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes memory still matters.